Thank you so much. I'm honored to be here and delighted to be with you this afternoon. I have to say something, though. You know, in radio, since it comes out of a studio, you often have a different impression of the person who's behind the mic. You don't look the way I'd imagined you. Robert Siegel, the great co-host of All Things Considered, gets a laugh every time he says that. So he's not coming down here, I don't think, in the next week, so I'm going to steal that line from him. I'm delighted to be here, and to be here at a time, actually, when there are many issues in the media that I think attract all our attention and, to some extent, pose great questions for us as Americans. And being here at this school, which is dedicated to the proposition that public service is not only important to the future of this country, but vital to it. I want to talk a little bit about the dynamics that we all face and who we are as citizens in the way of sort of embracing the realities that are presented to us by the media in this country. At National Public Radio, as Chance said, our audience now is about 27 million listeners a week in the United States. When I came to NPR at the beginning of 1999, less than a decade ago, NPR had been on the air for 27 years at that point, and the audience was 13 million. So it's doubled in the past less than a decade. And partly it's because of several things that are trends that kind of come together in a particular way that have opened a space for public service journalism and public service broadcasting in a uniquely new way. First of all, from the 2000 election on, we had virtually every year back-to-back what any reporter would consider a once-in-a-decade story that happened year after year after year. We had first the 37-day presidential election day, went on for a month and a half to decide, followed by 9/11, followed by essentially what amounted to a war brought to in which we got engaged in a war in Afghanistan, then the war in Iraq, then the 2004 election, then Rita and Katrina in the middle of all that, devastating a part of the United States as terribly as the previous devastation of the Civil War, and maybe worse in many ways. All these sequences brought Americans, drove them essentially to pay attention to the media, and I think we had drifted away from that because beginning in 1989, as the 20th century closed out, the Berlin Wall came down. In 1991, the Soviet Union broke up, and the entire paradigm that we had all lived in, that our fathers and forefathers, our uncles, our grandfathers, had struggled, put their lives on the line to bring about essentially peace, world peace, and the great division that had gone on in the Cold War era thereafter. All that ended. And I think we as a people were almost justified in sort of taking a walk in a certain way and saying, you know, we've won. The Cold War is over. The great sacrifices we made through the long, dreary decades of worries about nuclear weapons and thermonuclear weapons and massed armies and a great clash of ideas carried out perhaps in fields of conflict worldwide, that had actually, we had succeeded in eliminating that threat. And I think that a lot of serious journalism that was going on at the time, right up to the end of the Cold War, became not so important to us in the years thereafter. And I think it's perfectly natural and understandable. But then came a series of events which required us to look anew as members of a civil society, and not only a civil society, but a civil society that is self-governing, in which we needed to be, in new ways, newly informed as citizens, so we could try to make the best accounting of ourselves as how we were going to function and act in our civil society, whether it was at the level of the immediate block where I might live, or the community beyond that, or the state, or the region, or the nation. Some of this happened at a time when the American commercial news media, the for-profit companies, both in electronic media, in television, broadcast and in cable and in the big news organizations, encountered a whole series of changes going on. First of all, a new drive for expanding profits. And if you're a news operation, I spent 25 years at the Washington Post. If you're a news operation, about the only place you can cut costs is in the one thing you do, which is in the newsroom. That's the engine. And it's very hard to avoid, if you're under pressure to expand your profit margins, it's very hard to avoid not figuring out ways to do it cheaper, to do it quicker, to do it faster, and to do it with less cost and overhead. In this country, in the past decade or so, there's been a constant disinvestment on a real dollar basis, on a comparative dollar basis, across the newsrooms of this country. Just in the past year alone, about 1,000 newsroom jobs have been lost if you look at local, regional, national, whether it be in print or television or the cable or the electronic networks. Now, people are being added in the blogosphere and on the digital side in new means of exploring ideas, new means of reporting events, new means of determining facts and presenting them to people. But I'm talking about the traditional mainstream news organizations, which have been one of the great engines of public engagement, of information, and the dissemination of contextual, fact-based reporting on events that go past the headlines. We all can get headlines today on these things instantaneously. We can get headlines on our computers. We can get headlines essentially on our telephone if we want. And I can demonstrate that to you in a few minutes if you want to hear it. There's a way you can call a public radio station and they can tell you what the headlines were for the previous hour very quickly now. It's a service we provide for free. And at the end of the tree of possible story categories you could get, there's a button you can push that will allow you to support your local radio station. It's an experiment, but it's to try to make it as painless as possible, and I sure as heck don't want Skip to get out of a job at pledge drive time. My point here, though, is that the paradigms started to change, and the need for us to find information and to have context behind the headlines started to intensify. At NPR, when I came there, as I said, the audience was about 13 million at the beginning of '99. By September 10th, 2001, nobody knowing what was going to happen the next day, the audience had grown from 13 to 16 million over the course of nearly 3 years. 2 weeks after 9/11, the national audience to NPR was 20 million, and now it's 27. What was that about? Well, first of all, because all planes were grounded in this country for a couple of weeks, just remember back 8 or 10 days, people couldn't get to the television sets, and they had to get across the country. So people began by the thousands buddying up and doing essentially long-distance drives in rental cars or in friends' cars. I happened to be in Vermont the day the attacks occurred. A friend loaned me a car. I drove all the way down from Vermont. It's about 400 miles, 500 miles down to Washington that day. And I was glued to, guess what? The public radio stations as I drove south. So that happened to a lot of people. And the word went out that if you want really high-quality contextual that isn't simply going to repeat a tape loop every 20 minutes, the place to go where they're going to get behind the headlines and behind the images that are themselves unforgettable is a place called public radio. So we came into it in a different way, and it's driven us forward in a unique fashion. There is a thirst in this country. That's somebody calling in, actually. There is a thirst in this country, whether there's a Cold War or not a Cold War, for more information. It's been part of who we are since we were founded. The proposition, in my mind, and I've spent a lot of my life in what was then the Soviet Union and the post-Soviet Union, the FSU as it's called, the former Soviet Union. I ran Radio for Europe for about 4 years. I just happened to come back from Moscow barely a week ago. We put our children, when we were in Moscow, we put our kids into Moscow public schools. This was in the Soviet period. On what we thought was the sort of sound, rational reasoning that when they became teenagers, they wouldn't like us anyway, so let's give them a reason. And the older two are married to Russians, which is great. I've got 7 Russian-American grandkids. They're all bilingual. They won't speak to me in Russian anymore because mine is so rusty. It's an embarrassment to be caught anywhere in public with anybody listening, to have me stumble through my Russian to them. But my point here is that I know that the people in those regions of the world where there has been interdiction of the free flow of ideas, where there's been interdiction of free speech, where rights of assembly, of freedom of belief in religion, freedom of speech, and freedom of press have been interdicted by one reason or another, they have been diminished in their ability to have any effect on what happens to the course of their country, or the course of their nation, or the course of their people moving forward. To go all the way back before he wrote the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson, in an essay, I'm not going to put it in his 18th century English, I'm just going to do a 21st century soundbite. It applies to us today, and it's why we here today, you all, and Skip, and the great station, and this great school of public service, training the young and those people in mid-career coming back in, finding a new way to go forward, it had something for all of us to contemplate. Jefferson wrote that a people cannot be both ignorant and free. It is the most powerful proposition that I can think of, and as a lifelong journalist, I believe it is the driver for us going forward as it has been in the past. It is by no means an accident that the license for KUAR is held by the university. It tells you all you need to know, UAR, University of Arkansas, radio. The reality is that universities, the public universities and the private ones in this country, are part of the great skeptical testing of ideas, of facts, of different points of view, bringing, whether they be kids together or people in mid-career or anywhere else, bringing them together to test out their own ideas against the ideas that flow around the world. What's the purpose of that? It's to help them achieve disciplines of skepticism, not of interfering with their ability to believe or to have faith, but to put things to the test. Not so far away from here is a neighboring state whose license plate is classic American declaration. It's the show me state. And that's who we are as a practical people who want good ideas but also need to get down to the practicalities of making things work and finding common ground. And being able to hold a mirror up to ourselves that says who we are with all our challenges, our defeats, our failures, our shortcomings, and our successes. That's how we get forward in the world. We all know this. We know it in business, in education, in public service. It's not that life is a struggle, but it is a challenge. And as Jefferson wrote when he did write the Declaration of Independence, you know, he changed the great phrase that we had inalienable rights of life, liberty, and the first version said, and pursuit of property. And he changed it. And he changed it to something ineffable, which has been the road we've all been on, set free by the fact that it wasn't just written by a single person, but signed off on by dozens, thinking forward, life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. You know, my kids who live in Moscow, my son, my daughter lives in London, when we came back from Russia, our youngest kid said, "I'm your only American kid, no more borscht, no more Russian lessons." He lives in New Jersey. These kids, and whether we have grandchildren or not, or grandnieces and nephews, or any of the other sequences of generations in this country, we know we must pass on to them the disciplines of skepticism, the disciplines of contextual understanding behind the headlines. And we need places and we need institutions and organizations and enterprises that are dedicated to those propositions. In public radio, to my mind, and in public television, because they're nonprofit, they have an enormous advantage. They can come closer than almost any other organization still going in this country that is a news organization that closely resembles what Adolph Ochs, who is the founder of the great dynasty that owns the New York Times, when he bought the New York Times in 1896, and he'd cut his eye teeth on journalism in Chattanooga, Tennessee. He's basically a Southerner. But when he moved up to New York, having learned what he learned, He looked at this failing penny sheet, and he made a promise to himself and to his family. Every extra nickel that we earn from this thing, we're going to put back into it to make it better, to make it more comprehensive, to give it deeper contextual ability to present, as they said, all the news that's fit to print. At NPR and at our stations, because we have been freed from the pressures of the quarterly bottom line, because we're not owned by a consolidated conglomerate in which we are maybe part of an entertainment empire or part of a manufacturing and financial services empire like General Electric, which owns NBC. We're not part of some other enterprise. We're focused entirely on public service presentation of ideas, of exploration of cultural change and cultural encounter, and going behind the headlines to try to find out what went on yesterday or today and what may happen tomorrow that we need to know about to help us, inform us in the act of civic engagement. We've been free to do this. And so we've been at NPR, we've been able to, in my time, the news staff has about doubled. We now have more foreign bureaus than my alma mater, the Washington Post, which is a Fortune 600 company. We're operating 18 foreign bureaus, including, under very dangerous conditions, a full-time correspondent in Kabul, Afghanistan, and 2 or 3 people in our very dangerous environment of Baghdad. These remarkable people, and you've heard them on the air if you listen to public radio, Annie Garrels. I can just name the names, but I think of Annie in particular because she was in Baghdad before the war, and I knew her in Moscow when she was just a kid out of college and arrived and immediately got into trouble with Soviet authorities because her Russian was terrific, and she really knew how to get behind the headlines and get stories that they didn't want told. That's way back 30 years ago. This remarkable person has been at NPR almost 20 years now. We are there because we know, and somebody asked me recently in Washington, actually some Chinese government officials who were visiting NPR. These are basically government spokesmen for various ministries, and we talked about who we are, and they finally said, one of them said, well, I don't understand. If you don't pay the kind of network salaries and anchorman salaries that we hear about, why are your people in Iraq? What are they doing there? And I said, it's actually a mystery. I can't tell you exactly why, but I can tell you that they believe that the need to get the story out is what has to be done, and somebody has to do that. And we give them, dangerous though it is, we give them the opportunity to tell one of the most complicated and demanding and dramatic and challenging stories that's been in front of this country since the turn of the century. My point here is to finish off, to bring it back to the university, to the school, to the station, and to you all. We know, going forward, that we will be judged in the years to come by what we stood for. What this great school stands for is dedication to public service and to exploration. I've been talking to some of the graduate students here. They're going out in the world to do capstone activities. Many of them are going to go abroad to learn things they couldn't under any other circumstances have in their lives except through this means. Radio allows us to do the same thing for millions of Americans and for millions of people around the world who are coming to us online, by digital, and by satellite. We're on satellite transmissions basically around the world, and we're on about 150 foreign stations around the world, and we're a major news source on Armed Forces Network, about which I'm very proud. So we're available for people in new ways. Here in Little Rock, if we just think about the power of ideas and the power of bringing ideas together so that others can hear what they are, to explain them, to explore them, to explicate them, and then ultimately to get to the other E, engagement. That seems to me to be entirely what this enterprise is about, and it's what has given public radio a kind of tremendous power in a marketplace of ideas. At NPR, I can tell you for sure that our people in Baghdad, Kabul, in Johannesburg, in Dakar, Senegal, in Nairobi, in Mexico City, in Beijing and Shanghai and Moscow, Berlin, London, Rome, Sylvia Pajoli. And when we can get in to Havana, we're there, and in Rio de Janeiro, in Istanbul and Jerusalem and Cairo, and all around the country, and with our great member stations, KUAR and the other stations of this great state and this great region and around the country. We are joined together with you all in supporting and honoring here at the school, honoring the heart of the American democracy, which is tell me so I can know, so I can act as a citizen. Thank you very much.